Hello and welcome to this fireside chat at the Global Security Forum of 2021. My name is Ghosh. I am an opinion columnist and editor at Bloomberg, and I am delighted to be moderating this discussion with Singapore's Senior Minister for Coordination for National Security, and welcome Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean. Today's topic is cooperation for development and security. And this session, we're going to try and examine the approach taken by Singapore to addressing a very complex set of challenges over the past year, in particular to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and the potential for increased violent extremism, with a focus to the importance of multilateralism and development for securing the future of the Southeast Asia region and the wider world. We're going to start with Senior Minister Teo making some opening remarks, and then we'll follow with some questions and a discussion. Senior Minister, your remarks, please.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. It's good to be with all of you. I suppose I should say good day. We may be in different time zones, but at least we're on the same planet, and this is the only one that we have. It would appear that we are facing many immediate crises right now. Well, on the top of the minds of many people was the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban, and what that means for regional security, and of course, also whether terrorism on an international scale will rear its head again. So I think that's on the minds of many people, and one of the security concerns that we have. We are also facing a pandemic. After 21 months, it's still raging. Even with vaccines, it's still got some way to run. And it's claiming lives. It's got an impact on many facets of society. And I think the scarring effect will be with us for quite some time to come. Then we're also dealing with droughts, fires, floods all over the world. Huge forest fires in certain places, terrible floods, very heavy rains. Recently, we had some of the heaviest rains ever recorded in northwestern Italy. Several inches, tens of centimeters of rain within an hour. Quite incredible. And these are things which confront us, and we have to deal with them, these crises, on an immediate basis. Overlaid on top of this is, if you like, global competition, tussle between China and the US, which has an impact on many, many spheres. Already, we have seen the impact on trade flows, flows of technology goods, and this has impacted all countries who have an interest in this area. But I would say that what is more important is what happens next. I mean, we seem to be lurching from crisis to crisis. And while in one sense, all these different crises have different causes and different roots and are quite distinct, in some sense, they're all interlinked in some ways. I think they point to a dearth, a lack of global cooperation, multilateralism, and there's a great need for this in order for us to deal with these issues in a more comprehensive way. But first of all, we need to identify what are the goals and the guideposts that we need to have in order to proceed towards this future that we want. And I would suggest two or three of them. First of all, the multilateralism. I mean, this has anchored growth and development in the world, well, since the Second World War, and has brought prosperity to many, many countries. Developing countries, the developed countries, big developed countries like India and China. And this is something which we should continue to work towards. The alternative, of course, is a divided world, which we've seen in certain epochs as well. And I'm not sure that's a better world, better outcome for all of us. Second, I would say, is building more resilience. We've been living in a just-in-time world, for the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years, and that has become the mantra. But actually, just in time may not be good enough. And just in time, just enough may not be good enough. So we have to build greater resilience, both nationally and internationally, in order to deal with crises on a more comprehensive level. Some of it preemptive, preventive, but some of it also responsive. And dealing with these crises, natural disasters, and so forth, they are basic to human security. They're the most basic form of providing human security: life, health, prevention from hunger, famine, and so on. So these are the most basic forms of human security, which we should provide better for as individual countries and as a world. So good examples are things like COVAX and Gavi, which have attempted to make sure that vaccines are available to every country in the world. And I would say the third thing which we should focus on greatly is sustainable development. Whether we like it or not, we are on the same planet. This problem is not going to be resolved by each country sort of taking a nationalistic view, trying to protect itself, because no country can protect itself. I mean, if you take Singapore, for example, we contribute 0.1% of global emissions. But the other 99.9% affects us. We are a small, low-lying island. And something like 16% of our coastlines, where most of our economic infrastructure will be inundated if sea levels rise beyond a certain level. So I would say these are the guideposts for the future, even as we deal with current crises. Bobby?
Thank you very much, Mr. Senior Minister. That I like the way that you frame that into sort of three categories: upholding multilateralism, building resilience, and the topic of sustainable development. So let's take those one by one. We seem to be going through a period where deep and existential questions are being asked about whether multilateralism can survive. Some of the pillars of multilateralism give the appearance of weakening the alliances that, and this is not only something that happened during the presidency of Donald Trump, it precedes him and it has followed him. When you look around the world, do you see multilateralism coming under threat? Do you feel that we need to sort of establish the rules of multilateralism? Or are we overstating this threat?
Well, the rules that we have today, the institutions that we have, are obviously not perfect. But what do? Do we ignore them and discard them? And then what are we left with? We are left with nationalism, self-interest. If that's what drives the world, I think we will be in for a very difficult time. So if the institutions and the rules are not quite fit for purpose in the current circumstances and to deal with the future that we envision, then let's do something about these institutions and the rules to strengthen them, bring more people on board, develop more consensus, and work on them. I think if we make it more difficult for these institutions to function, then we will abandon multilateralism and we will have a big problem. There are two things here. One is self-interest. I think it is quite understandable that countries will act in their own self-interest. We must expect that. But there are narrow self-interests and enlightened self-interests. Narrow self-interest will only get us so far. And there's enlightened self-interest where we see win-win outcomes rather than win-lose, zero-sum outcomes through narrow self-interest. So enlightened self-interest is more likely to get us win-win outcomes, peace, stability, co-prosperity in the world.
We've come through this period when I'm old enough to remember when we thought that that history was over, the world was all going, everyone was heading in more or less the same direction, and all the big questions about how we conduct our relationships with each other as countries and how we conduct our relations within countries, all these big questions have already been answered. And then now, every day I open the newspaper and I see that there are those questions are being relitigated, and there are questions about whether there is a Western liberal way, democratic way of government, and whether there is a new Chinese formula, and whether these two ideas are inevitably in conflict and over a long period cannot work together. You're in a part of the world where both these, if you like, formula of government are being practiced all around you. Is it inevitable that these two should clash? Are there ways, to your mind, that we can work together even if we don't agree on how politics are conducted and how governance should be conducted?
I think first we should recognize that countries do have vast differences between each other in terms of the endowments they have on resources, the ratio of population to land and resources. I mean, if you look at China, you look at the United States, continental United States, and you look at Australia, the three of them are roughly the same size in terms of land area. They have some differences in geography. I mean, America is protected by two oceans and has generally friendly neighbors. But if you look at China, it's different. If you look at Australia, it's different. Australia has what, 25 million people, 30 million people? America has 330. And China has 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And it's on essentially the same land area. And they have different histories, they have different cultural traits. And to expect all of them to be the same is, I think, not realistic. So I would say that a good basis for countries to engage each other is to see enlightened self-interest and also to focus on good governance. That means the outcomes that we're looking for. Are the governments doing well by their people in terms of health, education, welfare, social justice, opportunities? I think those are the parameters that we should look for. If we take an ideological approach to the world, and I think we will have more difficulties because the same the ideologies may not be applicable. We may not be able to make other countries look like us. It may not be desirable at all. And we should allow countries to find their own path forward, but focus on good governance. Judge countries by how they deliver the goods to their people.
And you don't believe that, as some people do, this notion that a new rising global power will, whether we like it or not, whether it intends to or not, will automatically challenge the existing powers, and that friction is inevitable. You don't believe that this inevitability.
I think what will happen is that there has to be a rebalancing. It is not the same as before. But the question is, how do we bring countries together? So one of the things which several countries in our part of the world, both sides of the Pacific, have been trying to do is to bring the two sides of the Pacific together, where, of course, we have major countries on each side. We have America on the eastern side of the Pacific. We have China, Japan, major economic powers on this side of the Pacific. We have India as well in the Indian Ocean. And how do we bridge these two sides and not have a breach in between, which runs down the international date line? And so we have APEC to try and engage the Asia-Pacific economies and cooperation. And we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which tries to bring together countries, like-minded countries from both sides of the Pacific together. And the important thing about these institution building is that they are open and inclusive. So you can see that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was actually started by 4 small countries: Singapore, Brunei, Chile, and New Zealand. And the idea grew and grew and grew. And then we had the TPP, which brought in major economies. The US, for its own reasons, which I fully understand, decided not to join at the last moment. But it does provide a very high quality trading arrangement which can bring countries together in a cooperative way to build co-prosperity, rather than to compete with each other on a sort of bare knuckle way. So I think these kinds of things, practical solutions, are more important than ideological ones.
In recent weeks, we've seen in your part of the world, this new idea of an Anglo-sphere alliance between Australia, the UK, and the United States over nuclear submarines, and that has alarmed and upset China. These seem to run against the trend, or against what we would like to see as being the trend toward multilateralism. This seems to be the Chinese feel like they're being encircled and singled out, whereas the other side of that debate, there is an argument that then we need to protect our interests in that part of the world, and that China represents the greatest threat to those interests. This does not feel like this is not multilateralism at its best, to put it mildly. But you in Singapore find yourself caught right in the middle of all that, literally as well as metaphorically. How alarmed are you by these trends, and can multilateralism bring us out of this moment of crisis?
Well, the fact is that the US, the UK, and Australia are already the best buddies.
Yes.
They have had long security relations with each other. They support each other in security operations all around the world. They are 3 of the 5 eyes and cooperate very, very deeply. And all 3 have long histories of being involved in Asia. So this is nothing new. And I think what is important is that whatever new organizations come up, they should contribute towards strengthening the regional architecture and operate in a way which is as inclusive as possible. I think the region will be worse off if we divide into blocks. And this is the history of Southeast Asia. When Southeast Asia has been divided, we've had war, we've had calamities of all kinds. But we have enjoyed a period of peace because Southeast Asia has been united around certain principles. So I think it behooves all these countries, whatever they are, to strengthen Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and to continue to contribute to strengthening the countries in Southeast Asia. Now, I should say that Southeast Asia, ASEAN, has dialogue partners. And we also have the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. It's quite a mouthful, which engages extra-regional countries, extra-regional from ASEAN, in confidence building and capacity building. And the US, Australia are participants in that ADMM Plus. And I understand that the UK is interested and has already participated in some of the activities of the ADMM Plus at the capacity building level. And the UK also, in its own right, is seeking greater engagement with the ASEAN countries, as the US and the UK are dialogue partners and close partners of ASEAN. So I would say these are important engagements that should continue. And we should strengthen the regional organizations in order to maintain peace and stability in the region.
You started your opening remarks. You made a reference to the COVID pandemic. There is a glass half empty and glass half full view. The glass half empty bit is that the pandemic exposed some great flaws in the multilateral systems, that because the world did not respond in a timely and unified fashion, that affected collectively our ability to deal with the pandemic. And we are still in a situation where there is a horrible imbalance between the rich countries and the not so rich countries in terms of vaccination and dealing with the pandemic. how do you view it? Do you think that we have failed, or multilateral efforts have not been up to scratch? Was this inevitable? And what lessons are to be drawn from this that you can use for the next time? Heaven forbid, but the next time we are confronted with a planet level threat like that.
Yes. Well, I think that the world could certainly have done better in dealing with the pandemic. And for a period of time, I think many countries were consumed by what I had sort of characterized as narrow self-interest instead of enlightened self-interest. And let me explain. During the global financial crisis, I mean, many countries around the world cooperated very closely and helped us get through it quite quickly. So we had the G20, they met, the leaders met, they coordinated their financial policies in each of their countries. Those countries which were able to maintain a high rate of growth in order to cushion the global effects of the downturn in those countries that were afflicted by the global financial crisis. There was tremendous coordination, and the world benefited from it, and the individual countries which cooperated in their own enlightened self-interest also benefited from it. Now, for COVID, I think there were many lost opportunities. In fact, US scientists and Chinese scientists were cooperating, doing research in Wuhan to prepare for the next crisis. And they were looking at bats and other kinds of coronaviruses and all that. That is positive. But once the pandemic broke out, the virus came on the scene, there was fear, I would say even panic, and that sort of broke down, if you like, that cooperation broke down, and we went back into nationalism, we went back into a lack of cooperation, and that, I think, if you contrast the response to the global financial crisis with the contrast to the pandemic, in one, there was a considerable cooperation between the major powers. In the other one, there was a considerable lack of cooperation between
and it's a very short gap between these two. I mean, barely a decade and a half. What do you think changed in this period? Is it just personalities, individual leaders in different countries, or have there been some underlying trends in the way all of us as human beings think about our, as you say, self-interest? Has that changed dramatically?
Well, I would say that countries have had to respond to the pressures that come from the demands of their own people. And so there has been a trend towards nativism, nationalism of the, I would say, narrow self-interest kind for the last, even before the pandemic. And when the pandemic broke out, instead of coming together and cooperating, this sense was exacerbated. And people then started to point fingers at each other, to sort of try to protect themselves, regardless of how that affects others. And the concept that none of us is safe until all of us is safe was forgotten. But that is in fact true. So we need to work together. So I would say that leadership counts because leaders influence the way their countries think and behave. So we need good leadership at the national level, good leadership that can transcend the national level to look at enlightened self-interest on a global basis.
The other thing that stood out for me in your opening remarks was the point you were making about resilience and the contrast between the point I think you made was that we've lived in this sort of just-in-time, the idea of just-in-time being the right way to approach everything, not just manufacturing, but across the board. All kinds of solutions are best applied when they're just-in-time. And then we are confronted with a crisis like the pandemic, which exposed I suspect, I think it's fair to say, which exposed the absence of resilience, that we didn't have the deep reserves, not just of vaccines, which had to be invented just in time, but we didn't even have the deep reserves uh, of cooperative spirit that were required to tackle this crisis. Again, what are the lessons from the pandemic on this notion of building resilience? Are you seeing, perhaps it's too early, but are you seeing signs that we are building that resilience in the same manner that our bodies are building antibodies to deal with this crisis? Are we doing that as a planet, as a collection of countries?
I think there are signs of that, but we need to do more. Of course, that's a truism. If you take Singapore's example, in some ways, we as a small country, we're always concerned about resilience for the future. So I would say that for Singapore, in our response, we drew on three types of reserves, if you like. One is financial reserves, and we've been putting aside financial reserves for a rainy day, and we've had to draw on them again this time. So we have not needed to go into debt. We were able to draw on our financial reserves in order to fund the expenses that went into fighting the pandemic, as well as cushioning the effect on our people. The last time we drew on that was during the global financial crisis, when there was a steep downturn. We looked at the forecast for the next year, and it was just a bottomless pit, and we didn't know how deep it would go. So we drew on our reserves to cushion us. So financial reserves is one thing which we need to put aside. But second, we also have organizational capacity and reserves, the ability to respond either on a national basis or on a global basis in order to organize ourselves, bring resources to bear, and respond. But the third, which you pointed out too, Bobby, is also, how should I say, reserves of community spirit and bonding. And not just within the country, but also between countries and in the world community. How do we work together to address this crisis? Now, in a crisis, you can end up with divides becoming accentuated within a country and between countries. But we need to bridge those. And in peacetime, normal times, we need to strengthen them so that we can draw on these reserves when we need to. So if we have community, which, if you take the WHO, for example, there's been a lot of criticism about the WHO, but the WHO is what the members make it out to be. It depends on what the members want WHO to be and what the members resource WHO to be. So WHO can only be as good or as active or as resourced and resourceful as the members want it to be and allow it to be.
And which then brings us sort of fluidly into the third pillar of your opening remarks, which is sustainability. As Singapore is one of the wealthier countries, there are not a lot of countries that can have the sort of resources into which they can dip into in times of crisis. But crises, as you said, seem to be coming at us fast and furious, and from all sides, and some sides that we can't even see. How do we develop as a planet, or as a committee of nations? How do we develop this sustainability? Is there an argument to create new multilateral structures designed specifically to operate in crisis situations and try to get us to the point where everybody is safe, so that to the point that you were making, where if everybody's not safe, then nobody is safe. That idea, do we need new structures, new forms of multilateralism that are guided by that principle?
Well, sustainable development, which encompasses the whole concept of how we deal with climate change, is basically going to be the challenge of our times. We see the effects today. We may not be able to reverse all the effects that we're seeing, but we should try and mitigate them, and then also make sure that we can adapt to them and learn how to live with them. So I would say that we have the Paris Agreement. Uh, it is an imperfect agreement, but it is what we have. I think I have been looking at Singapore's positions with regard to the Paris Agreement, and our ministers and our officials have also been playing a facilitative role, trying to get these agreements to get agreement, and also now to have the various chapters under the Paris Agreement to be finalized. For example, carbon markets, which is a complex issue, and our Minister for Sustainability and Environment will be co-chairing the group trying to come to agreement on these things. So we try and facilitate that. Now, we need to work together on that, and we have the Paris Agreement, but we should try to improve ambition. We should try to see how we can move forward. We should see how we can share technologies and knowledge in order to allow countries to take the steps necessary to protect themselves, to reduce their carbon emissions, and contribute to the greater global effort to do so. It's going to be complex, but we can do so regionally. We're trying to do this within ASEAN. We need to do it on a more global level. I think that we are moving in the correct direction.
Because we have these relatively we have one relatively new crisis with the pandemic. We have the overhanging sort of existential crisis of climate change. It's sometimes, between these two things, we can lose sight of the other sort of in crises that affect large parts of the world, if not all of it. And you flicked at that again in your opening remarks when you talked about Afghanistan, the threat of extremism, the threat of countries and places where extremism can take root because there are not local structures to prevent it, or indeed there might be local structures that encourage the development of that extremist ideology. How concerned are you by the return of the Taliban to power in Kabul? Do you take the view that this is a new and different Taliban, that they have learned their lessons and that the world can collectively deal with them in a way that was not possible 20 years ago when they first came to power?
Well, I would say the jury is out on that. And when I work with people, when I deal with them, I listen to what they say, but I watch more carefully what they do.
Yeah.
And that is, will be tested over time and over actions that they take in specific circumstances. So I think the jury is out on that. We do hope that stability will return to Afghanistan, and that there will not be spaces where extremist terrorism, violence will grow and be exported to other parts of the world. I mean, in Southeast Asia, we were affected by what was happening in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda. The Bali bombing, for example, was directly linked to Al-Qaeda, and we had groups in Singapore who were planning attacks in Singapore. So we take this very, very seriously, and we don't take it lightly. And we do hope that we will have a new phase, a new beginning in Afghanistan. There's an opportunity now, and we hope that the people and whoever is governing the country will take advantage of that.
And of course, this forum is taking place in the Middle East, in Doha. And there have been, in the past year and a half, sort of a flurry of efforts in sort of using multilateral channels to solve regional issues. There's also been an outbreak of diplomacy, which is rare and I suspect quite welcome. The outreach to between Israel and several countries in the Arab world. Now, the cynical view is that these are these are countries that are being forced into these accommodations because the great powers are, or at least one particular great power, the United States, is losing patience with this part of the world, is withdrawing from this part of the world. But perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Whatever the reasons for diplomacy, would you say diplomacy is a good thing, regardless of what the reasons are behind it?
Well, I would say that it is a great good thing that countries are talking to each other, as you say. All the initiatives that you mentioned, the relations with Israel, in fact, the improved relations within the GCC countries, all of whom are our good friends. We are one of the few countries in the world which actually has a free trade agreement with the GCC. Singapore has a free trade agreement with the GCC, so, which was signed several years ago. And so we are really quite happy to see that the differences between the GCC countries also seem to have been ameliorated and working together again. So I think those are all very positive signs. But may I make a point that actually small countries do have agency. We don't need to depend only on the big countries to resolve issues. Now, let me give you an example. I talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership earlier. Well, yes, that was something started, the kernel of it was 4 small countries, relatively small countries. And it grew and grew and grew and became the TPP. For the G20, small countries, small and medium-sized countries also wanted a voice on the stage and not have their fates and their futures determined just by the big boys. So 30 countries got together to form the Global Governance Group, and we now have a voice at the G20 so that we have agency, we express our views, we are not just takers of what the big countries decide. So I think that's important. And it has come to the point where I think the world is much more diverse, and the big countries too have to accept and understand that and be prepared to take these views in.
I can't think of a better way to end this discussion. Senior Minister Teo, thank you very much for joining us from Singapore, and we hope to see more of you in the forum in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. And we look forward to a better world, building the future together for security. Thank you very much.
Thank you.